Polarization is one that I've been interested in for quite a while. I have been interested in politics most of my adult life, and the whole notion of how we have become so polarized certainly was something that I found very timely and interesting. I was happened to just catch a book review on NPR, and they had the author Erza Klein there, and I listened to it and I thought, wow, that's really, really interesting. And also, I felt positive about the fact that he had done a lot of research, and it was clear that he wasn't just spouting his opinion. So that made me intrigued enough that I bought the book. Erza Klein is editor at large and co-founder of Vox, which is an award-winning explanatory news organization. Previously was a columnist and editor at the Washington Post, and policy analyst for MSNBC, and a contributor to Bloomberg. As we go through this, a couple of caveats I want to give you. Screens that show up like this, just with text or whatever, those are really information right directly from Klein's book. There are some graphs and pictures. Those are items that I've brought in and added, so they're not his. When there are entire pages of information that I have imported from other places, those are marked with a star at the bottom, so that you'll know that they're not part of his book, okay? Also, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat area at any time, and they'll come into me, and then we'll see about trying to get answers for you. So an awful lot of what we surmise about political parties in the United States often goes back to the 1950s, and the notion that many of us have that it was during this time that there was really a very strong bipartisan support in Congress. They worked together, got things done. To some extent, that's true, but there's also some kind of revealing information about how that happened. It isn't quite as positive. The political parties at the time, the Democrats were composed of the mainline Democrats and the Dixiecrats. And the Republicans had both liberal and conservative elements to their party. What many people don't realize is that the breadth of the political parties at the time. This graph shows you that both the Democrats and the Republicans had a very wide range of perspectives within their party. The Democrats were slightly more liberal, and Republicans slightly more conservative, but they both covered, in their membership, covered a very wide expanse of opinions. What's interesting is that in the mid-1950s, a Senate leader observed that the second most conservative member of the United States Senate was a Democrat, which today we would find pretty astounding. And in the Republican Party at the time, there were more liberal kinds of people such as Nelson Rockefeller, Everett Dirksen, Margaret Chase Smith, George Romney, C. Douglas Dillon, and Prescott Bush. And it's not easy to picture those people being part of, the our political parties today. Another thing that we should know about these parties and their wide expanse of opinions is that the party platforms were not super specific about where they stood on particular issues. Their wording was very broad to allow all of these people of such wide differing opinions to reside within the same party. Party philosophies were quite broad, and there was often common ground between the two parties on various issues. And differences of opinion often tended to be more driven by geography and where people were from rather than anything else. So that's something that was peculiar of the time. So how did they manage to get things done? Well, one of the things that, if you think about the image of a football field typifying the operations of Congress, one of the things that really was symbolic of this period was that the Congress operated pretty much within this area, between the 30-yard lines of both. And so they were close together in their perspectives, and they didn't have a whole bunch of people over here and over here to kind of detract from their focus. So that really was something that was very significant about this point in time. So that you could be pretty liberal or pretty conservative and still be within, the framework of your party here. What were the policies of the two parties like? Well, it really depended on the issue. They didn't have overall positions. They really kind of decided when each issue came up what position they were going to take. And even then, there wasn't necessarily party unity. The kind of thing that we have seen, Mitch McConnell do of telling, his entire congressional party, you're going to vote this way, you're going to vote that way. That wasn't really how things were done back during this time. Each congressman, each senator made their own decisions. Of course, they had to live with their decisions and the consequences of those, but they were free to decide for themselves where they were going to be. So if that was the case, how did change happen? What led to things becoming so polarized? Well, there are a number of things that influenced it that Klein outlines in his book. And he basically kind of starts in the 50s and 60s and works his way to the present, showing how chronologically the changes occurred. The Dixiecrats, who were the conservative members of the Democratic Party, were from the Deep South. They were very conservative, and they had quite a hold on power in Congress. Many of them had been in their positions for a long time. A number of them were committee chairmen, and so they had a lot to say about what went on. That began to change with the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education, because it began to chip into their positions that we'll see in a minute here. The Civil Rights Law that came into effect in 1964 was a landmark decision for civil rights, and it led to the Dixiecrats deciding that they didn't think the Democratic Party was where they belonged anymore. Dr. Martin Luther King was mobilizing Afro-Americans, and the television broadcast of these demonstrations had an impact across the country. And it caused people to begin to question themselves about where they stood on issues of race, and sort of questioning themselves about where do I stand on this issue, and what does it say about me in terms of where I stand? Do I need to really kind of clarify for myself where I stand on this, because it's becoming, pretty strong issue here. So voters began to define themselves on the issue of race and their expectations about rights, particularly for Afro-Americans. And this led to the beginning of parties starting to define, where they as a party stood on issues. During the 1950s and 60s, the Democratic Party had a large number of Dixiecrats who were very conservative. They were also segregationists. They believed in the suppression of voter rights for Afro-Americans. So much so that in 1953, 1.3% of the eligible Afro-American voters in Alabama were registered to vote. And in 2 counties, there were no Black voters registered. There was a lot of intimidation that was, exercised to prevent them from registering, and if they registered, preventing them from voting. Many of these Dixiecrats had very powerful positions in Congress, as I said. They even at times had power over the president with the decisions that they could make. They were able to maintain these positions because the people voting for them were the white Southerners who were voting them repeatedly back into office. So their policies of segregation and of intimidating the Afro-American vote was, pretty well entrenched. And you can see here how this impacts issues when the civil rights things really begin to come up. The voting is very different from what we would expect today. But in 1964, in the Civil Rights Act, votes in the House showed 80% of the Republicans voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act and 60% of the Democrats. So that's something that we would find pretty astounding today. In the Senate, more Republicans voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act than Democrats. However, Senator Barry Goldwater, who was to become the Republican nominee for president in '64, voted against it. The act was passed, and almost this fact is something that was certainly not publicized at the time and was kept very quiet. But the act was passed, managed to get passed with an agreement that there would be no anti-lynching legislation and that Blacks would be prohibited from joining Social Security. So that was part of the swapping of votes that went on with the Dixiecrats, getting them to support things by saying, okay, you want this, we'll give you that in return. Okay. With the passage of the Civil Rights Law of '64 and the Voter Rights Act of '65, the Dixiecrats decided they needed to get out of the Democratic Party. It was not, it was not where they belonged. So they moved to the Republican Party, and the Republicans welcomed them. During the Eisenhower administration, 44% of the Black voters who voted for Eisenhower. But in 1964, with Barry Goldwater running for president, 7% of Black voters voted for him. At the time, Republicans thought, well, they didn't like Goldwater, and they could understand why the Republicans would be, why the Blacks would be opposed to Barry Goldwater, but it was about him, and they would come back to the Republican Party as soon as this election was over with. That wasn't the case. When blacks moved to the Democratic Party, by and large as a group, they stayed there. These two moves were the beginning of change in political parties. So how different was American politics prior to our, things becoming so polarized? And I pulled together some things here that Klein has in his book that point out some of the differences of perspective in parties that might find very interesting. John Kennedy was opposed to political parties taking defined policy decisions because he felt that the country was already split enough between the geographic areas, the various sections of the country, races, and ethnicity. And he felt it would be unwise to also split between conservatives and liberals. And that by having defined policies in the party, that was exactly what was going to happen. Kind of interesting that that was borne out by Richard Nixon. Would you believe? Richard Nixon created the EPA, Environmental Protective Association. He proposed a basic minimum income, and he proposed a national health care plan that was much more ambitious than Obamacare. Now, those last two things he didn't get passed, but it's interesting to see that he put them on the table. Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush both raised taxes. Would you believe George H.W. Bush supported and signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and he supported regulations to reduce pollutants causing acid rain. Ronald Reagan signed immigration reform and spoke at the signing. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered here illegally. Pretty astounding, huh? Mm-hmm. Bill Clinton, he worked with the Republicans to slash welfare and to balance the federal budget. Would you believe that LBJ in 1965 created a massive single-payer health care system for the elderly called Medicare? It became law with the aid of 70 Republican members of the House voting for it and 13 Republican senators. Those senators were led by Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois. In 1982, Senator Joe Biden voted for a constitutional amendment to overturn Roe versus Wade. President Gerald Ford also supported the amendment. In 1976, the Republican platform called abortion a difficult question and did not stake out a position for the party, as there were Republicans in Congress who believed in the concept of people being allowed to have abortion on demand. How have things changed? In 1979, the public described the relative positions of the two parties this way. 54% of the people said that Republicans were more conservative than Democrats. 30% said there was no real difference between the parties in terms of the conservative and liberal. Ticket splitting was fairly prevalent, with 20 to 25% of the electorate being swing voters. Today, swing voters are about 4 to 7% of the electorate and shrinking very fast. And Obamacare was modeled after Mitt Romney's plan design, but it got no Republican votes in the House or Senate. So those are some of the changes that we see beginning to occur here. So as parties began to take specific positions on topics that really began to influence things. Those were, because once you have those embedded, it's hard to get them changed. It's hard to get those positions modified. And, you know, people feel like that it's very hard to modify them as they go along. The interesting thing about it, though, is that the notion of taking positions was something that often was done in name only, and not really with a strong emotional commitment from members. So by taking these positions, it doesn't leave much room for compromise. It causes the opposition to be defined differently. Now all of a sudden they become they. It kind of results in an athletic team mentality where the notion is like, we have to beat them at all costs. And reactions and positions are based much more on feelings, much less on fact. It creates rivalry and anger. And the opposition is seen strictly in negative terms. So those are some pretty big shifts in attitude coming about in this process. How's the game played today? Well, the game today is played by one group being down in this end zone and the other group being over here in this end zone. And there are very few people out in here, which makes it very hard to bring people together to reach compromise. There's a much greater party identification today than there was in the 1950s. 1950s, 30% of voters identified themselves as ticket splitters. This demise today, down to 4 to 7%, is not because people have developed a much more intense like for their party. Rather, it's because they've developed a much stronger dislike for the opposition. And our political identities have become a much more powerful identifier. Our partisan identities have merged along with race, religion, geography, ideology, cultural identities, and it makes it very hard to hold people together when they're embedded so far apart. Now you might ask, you know, isn't there always been some strong party allegiance? Well, we'll look at that in a minute, okay, and see. When did Democrat and Republican become dirty words? In 1960, public was asked, how would you feel if your son or daughter said that they were going to marry someone of the opposite political party? 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said that would bother them if their child did that. In 2010, the same question was posed. 49% of Republicans and 53% of Democrats said they would be upset if their child was to marry somebody of the other political party. These ratings, the 49 and 53, are much higher than how they rated their child marrying someone of another race or of another religion. So political party was more of a deterrent. As one person quoted and said, well, political party is fair game for hatred because you choose to become a Republican or a Democrat. Racial identity isn't fair game because you don't really have any choice about your race. Often today, you hear a lot of people make comments about, you know, I have good friends who are educated people and nice, understanding people, and they support this position, this candidate, that candidate. I just don't get it, how they can take that position when there's so much evidence against it. Well, research has shown that when it comes to political candidates, positions, and agendas, that if someone has taken a position on one of these, and then they are presented with facts contrary to their position, they will deny, alter, deflect, modify, or in some way explain away facts which threaten their position. Because of polarization, people feel their position is threatened even before they are presented with contradictory information. One of the things that Klein points out in his book is that you see more instances of people who, by the tone of the conversation, assume that a person is going to confront their position and to begin defending it before they even are really questioned about their position. They perceive it as a warfare mentality and feel that they must defend their position at all costs. And as Dan Cahan, a researcher, has pointed out, in a polarized environment, once people have taken a political position, their priority becomes in winning the argument and of not losing their standing in the community or losing their place in the tribe. Their concern is over the possible loss of their identity. Once group loyalties are engaged, you can't change people's minds by utterly refuting their arguments. Individuals will consistently resist factual information that threatens their defining values. Now, when we say that people have always had strong allegiance, at least in commitment, in name, to their political party, one of the things we have to remember is that while that may have been so, that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it meant something very different. Because if you're committed to being a Democrat or a Republican in this kind of environment that existed back then, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're for or against this or that, because the breadth of the party is so broad. So the identity at that point meant something very different than what it tends to mean today. Because you said you were a Republican in 1955, didn't necessarily identify you as someone who was supporting this or this or this or this. So people had to explore with you to find out where you really stood on things. So how have elections changed that have contributed to this whole polarization thing? Well, today party platforms define more positions or more topics in detail. This leaves little room for cooperation or compromise. Campaigns become more polarizing because candidates realize that kind of the more outlandish they are, the more interest it creates in them. While partisanship is stronger, political parties are weaker. And this has some negative aspects to it. One of the things that I put in here about candidate selection, in olden times when somebody wanted to run for president, let's say, party leaders would get together in the proverbial smoke-filled room and decide who they thought should be the candidate. It wasn't by popular choice. You know, there were a group of party leaders who made the decision. And their number one criteria was who really has the kind of personality, the kind of perspective, the broad enough approach that a lot of people will support this candidate. And that was very important to them. And that was what they looked for. So they were the gatekeepers of the party to try to make sure that candidates, you know, that met those qualifications. Well, that's not how it's done anymore. After 1968 and kind of the rebellion of people over how the selection of the candidate for president was made on the Democratic Party, primaries came to play. There were primaries before this, but they were non-binding, so it really didn't mean a whole lot. Primaries came into play with increasing presence, so that now that was the determining measure of how someone got selected. And what's happened with that is that only 30 overall average, 30% of eligible voters vote in the primaries, which means that a mobilized group of supporters of a particular candidate can have huge impact. And that's what's been happening in many cases, is that you get a group of really gung-ho people to organize, and they can have a tremendous impact in a primary. This low participation makes parties vulnerable to demagogues. Polarized candidate selection means that adored people become candidates rather than those who have broad appeal. This further diminishes the power of party elites, of course. And people give money to the candidates who mobilize the base, which often then leads to more polarization. Candidates who thrive on individual donations are often more polarizing because basically they can be bought by particular interest groups. So all of these things can contribute to the polarization. Elections have taken on the mentality of sports teams. Winning at all costs is what it's all about. We have to defeat them. The intensity of these feelings and the need to defeat are captured in this voter quote. Well, I think Howard Dean should take his tax hiking, government expanding, latte drinking, sushi eating, Volvo driving, New York Times reading, body piercing, Hollywood loving, left-wing freak show back to Vermont where it belongs. So, demographic change in this country has had a tremendous impact on the whole notion of issues and what drives decision making, how to rally people. One of the quotes I took out from the book here is, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And that the feelings around this have been increasingly weaponized by a lot of the people in politics. This has made race a major issue in the context of what issues are used by candidates to develop support among white voters. You have to understand that a part of this is that in terms of the population, that whites are now in a minority. So the notion of trying to hold that group together as a group in a voting pattern is something that parties can strive for, because they they feel that it's really necessary. And it also leads to various issues associated with race becoming hot topics. There's a subtext of this in that race is a factor in the positions of the major political parties. Since the mid-1960s, the Republican Party has been increasingly white, and conversely, the Democratic Party has become increasingly diverse. There have been several results of this. One is that the Republican Party members are more susceptible to concerns over the demographic changes and the loss of privilege. It also means that the positions taken in party policy have become more entrenched, and as society changes, the party is less flexible in being able to adapt to these changes. And conversely, the Democratic Party has been embracing many of the changes of equality and working to select candidates who represent a more diverse makeup of society and of the party. This diversity at times makes it more difficult for the party to speak with one voice. Now, keep in mind, these are Klein's positions from his book, but he's talking about the impact of the changing demographics and how he sees it being played out politically. The media. This is a huge topic that has many aspects to it. And it certainly is a major factor in polarization. There are publications and TV channels that are highly polarized. These outlets have high viewership. These outlets constantly present the position that your political belief system is right and they are just wrong. Again, that's operating in the end zone, not out in the midfield. They also imply that because you are right, you have the right to win, to succeed, to be in charge. As the demographics of parties change, the animosity between the parties becomes greater. Some media outlets focus on the most outlandish things about opposition members and try to portray these positions or characteristics as representative of the entire party. And I put in parentheses here because I couldn't think of a better example than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Here she is, she's a freshman in Congress. And if you know anything about Congress at all, freshmen have so little power, and yet because she has taken some strong positions and been involved, with the green emphasis, she often is quoted by news media as if she were the spokesman for the entire Democratic Party. And she's nowhere close to being in a position like that. And yet, because some of her positions tend to be pretty extreme, it's portrayed that, yep, that's the way the Democrats are. That's where they go again, following that. So, and there are examples on the other side that are just as flagrant, of being fringe people being used and fringe incidents being used to portray various things within a party and to make them sound as if they represent the position of the entire party, and that's where all Republicans or Democrats stand. The media tends to often go beyond facts. They work to try to unite a group in opposition to the other party. And some media follow the mantra, if it's outrageous, it's going to be our lead. So we're going to use to draw people in. That's the way to get attention. Speaking of outrageous, one of the points I meant to make earlier when talking about people in Congress and how they can, in some ways, thrive if they take extreme positions. One of the ones that Klein points out in his book, you may remember some years ago, when Barack Obama was delivering a State of the Union address, that a congressman hollered out, "You liar." It was something that had never happened before. Anything like that. It was a total breach of protocol. And afterward, he was a Republican. Afterward, some of the Republican leaders really took him to task over what he had done. But he also benefited by huge financial donations immediately following that incident. So here was this little known freshman congressman all of a sudden getting this huge boost of funds over really an extreme behavior. So you can see where when extreme behavior is rewarded, that's not something that other politicians are going to ignore. And that leads to more and more of this polarization. In terms of the media, this extreme reporting leads to misinterpretation of actual events, and it means that the media alter their priorities, and it becomes, what can we do to get and hold an audience rather than are we really reporting the facts? When individuals tune into this kind of media feed, they don't get an accurate picture of people and events, and it makes it much harder for them to understand another point of view. Focuses on personalities who cause the most volatile reactions. Polarized media causes consumers of the material to become more polarized, and as the system becomes more polarized. So it's a cycle. It's feeding itself over and over and over. And to appeal to a polarized public, political actors behave in more polarized ways, which then creates a more polarized public. So, you've got actors, pushing polarization behavior into the public eye, the public reacting to it and going with that, which then causes the, individuals, leaders, politicians to become more polarized. So, it's a pretty wicked cycle. Social media has had a tremendous impact in the last 7 or 8 years, because it allows people to look at what's there and assume if it's on the internet, it must be so. They assume the credibility of what they see. And with a click of a button, they can respond to something, and can do so without any forethought as to what they're doing. Where, at least in a face-to-face conversation, they'd be more likely to have some think time while the other person's talking, and to maybe couch what they're going to say a little more diplomatically, or to maybe think, well, I'm not so sure this is so. But it really gives people a chance to right away hit the button and let it go. It gives people an opportunity to grandstand. And in many ways, the grandstanding can perpetuate passing on information that lacks credibility. It gives the person an opportunity to create reactions from people not possible in any other media, and to have a wider audience than they would get in any other media. It takes some of the initiative that had been started in cable news and talk radio and injects it with steroids, so that some of the stuff that it was radical on talk radio has become super radical on social media. And for some people, it gives them an opportunity, frankly, to stir up trouble. There are people who there are people who knowingly will take things that they're almost certain or they sound really good, but there's probably not a whole lot of truth to them. But boy, is this going to rankle that group or this group. So let's go with it. So now this social media stuff are things that I've been able to pull. This, I think, came out of the a writer in Atlantic magazine who just recently did a whole thing on social media and how it's impacting the political realm. And so this is not in Klein's book. I saw this last week and I thought, oh, this fits so well. I've got to use this. Sorry, the print is so small. And I tried to enlarge it and wasn't able to, but it's just, he's later, son. Right now, Daddy is busy sowing disinformation. And that's what I was just talking about. You know, it's the thrill that some people get out of putting out stuff that they know is going to do nothing except stir people up. So, and actually, this is pretty complex, and I think probably this is a good stopping point for tonight. And we'll start with this on Thursday, because getting into this chart of where does the media fall and so forth, it's probably going to take a while for us to look at. So we, you have any questions tonight? Nope, nothing yet. Okay, all right. So we'll see you again 7 o'clock Thursday, and we'll be kicking off with looking at the media and what's happened with media and its impact on politics in the United States and political opinions. And thanks for being with us.